Let's make a basic raspberry mousse together. This style of mousse is used a lot of the time when you are working with fruit, so it's a really great basic recipe to understand. And as far as some of the mousse recipes we've explored so far, the vanilla unglaze base and the chocolate base, this one is definitely the most challenging. There's a lot going on. First, I'm going to bloom my gelatin. I'm using sheet gelatin, though of course you could use powdered gelatin or gelatin mass. And after that's soaked in some ice cold water, I'll just wring it dry and then move on to adding my raspberry puree into one saucepan. Then in a separate saucepan, I'm going to add my water and sugar. And then into a bowl, I'm going to put my cream. As you might guess from this preparation, we have our gelatin and the fruit puree going together. We're going to make a meringue, and then we'll also have a whipped cream. So we have three separate components that are going to be folded together at the end to create this meringue. And while it is a bit challenging, it is such a fantastic texture and so delicious. I'm beginning with the puree on the stove here, and you aren't really going to see much of a difference, but I am bringing this puree up to a scald. I want it hot enough so that it can completely dissolve the gelatin. So once I see steam rising from the pan, I'll take it off the heat, immediately add in that gelatin, and I'm also adding a bit of lemon juice. I'm going to give this a really good stir until that gelatin is completely dissolved. Now, I want this to cool before I incorporate the other components for this mousse, but I don't want it to cool so much that the gelatin sets up. So as soon as I've got the gelatin incorporated into the puree, I'm going to start working on my Italian meringue. If you've never made an Italian meringue before, I have my water and sugar here in a saucepan. You really don't need to stir this or want to stir this, though you do want to gently move the pan around a little bit to make sure that the sugar dissolves completely. And I'm just going to keep an eye on it. And once it reaches about 100 degrees Celsius, when this sugar mixture is coming up to a boil, the sugar should be completely dissolved at this point. At this point, I'm going to go back over to my mixer. I recommend a stand mixer for this process, and I am going to begin whipping my egg whites at a really low speed. I don't want to whip these too much because I will increase the speed as soon as the sugar mixture comes up to about 118 degrees Celsius. For an Italian meringue, if you incorporate in the really hot sugar syrup too early, it's really easy to curdle the egg whites, which is absolutely disgusting. But if you wait too long and the meringue has already formed, if the egg whites are already super stiff and super fluffy, then the sugar is going to have a really hard time incorporating and creating a really strong meringue. So you want the egg whites to be whipped a little bit when we stream in the sugar, but we don't want it to be whipped too much, which is why I start whipping up the egg whites when I do, and why I recommend using a stand mixer, because if you're using a hand mixer, you have to have one hand on that, your eyes on the stove, and it's just a little bit more cumbersome. Once the sugar syrup is at 118 degrees, remove it from the heat and wait just until you stop seeing all of those bubbles rising from the bottom of the pan there. But you don't want to let the sugar cool off too much, just so that the bubbles aren't really vigorous and boiling up there. As you can see, my egg whites are really nice and frothy. They were at like a soft peak before. Now I'm going to increase the speed of my mixer and slowly stream in the sugar. As you can see, I'm pouring the sugar against the side of my mixing bowl. If you just directly pour it in without being really careful, without pouring against the side, it is really likely that that sugar syrup will hit the whisk, and if it does that while the whisk is moving, it will throw the syrup all over the sides of your bowl, and it gets really, really messy. Continue whipping until you have a medium stiff peak. It should still be slightly soft, a little bit cooled down, really nice and firm. Set that meringue aside for a moment while you whip up the whipped cream to a soft peak. Just for ease, I did this with a hand mixer, though if you have a second bowl for your stand mixer, you can do it with your stand mixer as well. As soon as the cream reaches that soft peak stage, it is going to be time to finish creating the mousse. So this is something that's really important, that you are organized, you're ready to go before you begin this entire process, because even though there's a lot to do, it actually moves quite quickly. I am going to transfer the meringue into a large wide bowl, and as soon as I have that in there, I am going to pour the slightly cooled raspberry puree that has the gelatin and the lemon juice inside of it over the top of this meringue, and I'm going to fold them all together. Like with any mousse, you can begin creating your mousse by using a whisk, since you generally have two different components that have really incredibly different texture structures. So here we have that liquid and the meringue, really different in texture. I'm going to continue adding in that puree, still using my whisk, and then once everything is incorporated, I am going to switch over to my spatula as I incorporate in the whipped cream, just to make sure I'm not over whipping or over mixing anything. As you can see, we have a really soft peak on this cream. It is just perfect. Remember, there's a ton of air in the meringue. There is gelatin in here, so you don't have to worry about this being too soft. This is the perfect texture. Now, as soon as I don't see any of the streaks of cream remaining, I am going to transfer this mousse into the vessel I want to set it in. If you are working with an entremet, or you're using this as an insert for something, or you're making a cut cake, you can just immediately pour it or scoop it into whatever that mold is. However, if you are doing something like how I'm creating a verrine, so I want to pipe it into a relatively small space, you can also transfer the finished mousse into a piping bag and then pipe the mousse into that vessel. Now, as you can see, this is a cumbersome, messy process. A lot is happening at once, but as soon as you get to this point, it is really easy, really smooth sailing. So I am just going to fill up these jars with my raspberry mousse, depending on how you plan to serve this, what you're doing with it. If you're putting it again into a silicone mold or a cake ring or anything like that, you may want to use a spatula or an offset spatula to create a really clean edge at the top. Otherwise, this can go directly into the refrigerator to set if you're going to just enjoy it as it is, which is what I'm doing. Or if it's something you plan to unmold later, then you can get that mold into the freezer so it can set and be unmolded. Now remember, this mousse has gelatin in it, so as we put this into our refrigerator in particular, this is going to need several hours to completely set up, even though the temperature right now feels quite cool because it has the cool whipped cream, it has the mostly cooled off meringue, the puree has mostly cooled down, so it feels like it should be basically at room temperature or on the cool side, but this is something that we really want to give a chance to set up completely, so I recommend at least 4 to 6 hours in the refrigerator before you dive into this. Once it's set up, you can just eat it. Look how light and fluffy it is. It's honestly like a raspberry cloud. You could serve this with some fresh raspberries, some jam, some extra whipped cream, anything you want. I hope you enjoy this basic fruit mousse recipe. I think it is so divine, and again, one of the types of mousse that is really great to understand how to work with as you move forward and learn more about mousse and create more complicated mousse-based desserts in your kitchen. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Until then, have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye!